I love Scribe.
I think this, a study, as long as there's breaks, I mean, hey, we can do however long we need it.
I'm just
So-
joking, Mario.
I would be fine with that long study.
Where's Scribe? He didn't want to attend?
We're not sure.
Nobody knows.
I know where he is.
I blame football, frankly.
He's in his nativity.
I second the motion.
Yeah, like Kes said. Yeah, that already happened.
Yeah, like 2,000 years ago, but they're still doing it.
Oh my gosh.
You're my hero, Wash.
Okay, on that note. On that note, we're gonna get rolling. All right. That does remind me. Next week, we will likely do some sort of Christmas study. Or come on that either Scribe or I. See if I can recruit Scribe to do it because nativity. No, just kidding.
I think I started recording too early.
Yeah. We've got random discussion and spam commercials. Okay, so a little bit of review. What did Scribe talk about last week?
Romans.
Yeah. Typically what in Romans?
Sanctification.
Yes. What is sanctification?
The thing that happens after justification, like justification is the one-time deal. You're saved, and then the ongoing process of becoming more and more holy, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Good job.
Got another answer.
Go ahead, Sprinkles.
Analogy. Sanctification is adding this to your life to make it better, just like you add chocolate to your milk to make it better.
Was that a Scribe analogy?
No.
Okay.
I have that on a t-shirt.
Interesting.
I feel like I've heard that somewhere before.
I would say, I would say it's even more than that, because if it's just to make our life quote unquote better, at least from what I see or heard, even a simple change of thinking how to see a certain thing can make the life better. Of course, I know what you're saying there, so I want to agree, but I cannot wholeheartedly agree, because you see what some of those wolves in sheep clothes are preaching, for instance, and yeah. Just saying. Sorry.
Was there? Alright. So we're going to kind of continue on in that vein a little bit tonight. We're going to switch tacks a little bit and start talking about the difference between the law and grace. Yeah, that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to be in Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. We're going to start with verses 1 through 7. Can I have a volunteer to read verses 1 through 7? Get a link.
Is it from the link from last time? There you go.
Hashtag first. Okay. Go ahead,
Gotta
Sprinkles.
love you all.
Yay!
Yeah.
Since I am speaking to those who understand law, brothers, are you unaware that the law has authority over someone as long as he lives? For example, a married woman is legally bound to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law regarding the husband. So then, if she gives herself to another man while her husband is living, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law. Then, if she gives herself to another man, she is not an adulteress. Therefore, my brothers, you also were put to death in relation to the law through the crucified body of the Messiah, so that you may belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we may bear fruit for God. For when we were in the flesh, the sinful passions operated through the law in every part of us and bore fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law, since we have died to what held us, so that we may serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. What should we say then? Is the law sin? Absolutely not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin if it were not for the law. For example, I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, do not covet.
Thank you. I actually, in my notes, put one verse too far there.
Oh.
That's okay. It's not your fault. It's mine. So we're talking about verses 1 through 6 first. Good reading. All right. So, Paul talks about us being dead to the law in the sense of marriage. So, he says that marriage vows end in death. They're till death do us part. So, that means that they're for life. You know, when you get married to someone, you're married to them for life. But if one of the people... What's that?
I was just celebrating, that's all.
When you get married to someone, you're married to them for life. But if one of the people dies, then it's not wrong to go and marry someone else, with one notable exception. What would that exception be?
Exception for remarrying, or what do you mean?
Yeah, so normally it's not a sin if one of the people on the marriage dies and the living person goes and gets married. At what point would it be a sin? There's one specific circumstance where that would be a sin. Yes. Yes. Death was resulted of murder. Yep. So that would be a case where because I have in my notes that's never a sin. I'm like, well, actually, technically, that's not true. Yes. So unless the death was brought about by the living spouse. Yes. So there's plenty of examples in history where this has happened, where somebody dies, person who is still alive goes and gets remarried, and that's okay. God allows that. He in 2 Timothy he actually says that's an okay thing. So Paul is using that as an example of the law. So when we were first alive, when we were understood the law, we were bound to the law. We were under the law for life. That was a lifelong covenant like marriage. The only way to be free was for one of us to die. Now, can the law die?
The law itself is always there.
Right. Right, the law is eternal. The law can't die.
I don't know. Just thinking law is like Schrodinger's cat, because it's alive and dead at the same time. So if you think about it, when Christ died for us, he kind of killed the law, but at the same time the law is alive in him.
So technically you might be correct, but we're going to stick with no, the law can't die for the sake of my awesome example.
We're going to completely ignore everything, everyone. Please, carry on.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. No, so I would make... So I see what you're saying. I would argue that Christ is fulfilling the law, not killing the law, because he didn't come to destroy the law, right? He says that. So I am actually going to disagree with you. But so he came to fulfill the law, not destroy the law. But so the law can't die because the law is eternal. Law is proclaimed by God, right? And what God says can't be undone. But so that loophole is closed. The law can't die. So who in that relationship, if we're married to the law, who can die?
We can.
Right. We can.
Us.
Yeah. We can very much die. We die. Humans die all the time. So, the loophole is for us to die. Well, how do we die and be freed from the law? Verse 4 is a hint.
How to phrase it is another.
So, we died to sin through Christ. Remember? We died and were raised again to new life in Christ.
Baptism.
Same thing with the law. When we died to sin, we died to the law. So we died with Christ, and we're raised again that we might now be bound to Him instead of the law. So in this particular example, saying single after death is not not an option. We have to be bound to something, either the law or to Christ. So we are, when we die in Christ, or trust in Christ, we die in the sin, die in the law, and are raised to a new life. A life of Christ through the Spirit. So we're no longer under the law. We no longer serve the law. We now serve Christ. Singleness is okay. I'm saying in this particular illustration, not true for real life. Just putting that out there. But yeah, let's talk about in verses 4 through 6. Verse 6, but now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not the old way of the written code. So now we no longer have the same obligations. So like when you're married to someone, you have a set of obligations, a set of priorities. There, and you have to, if you want your marriage to be good, serve that person, serve their needs. Not just think about yourself, but put them first. Make sure they're taken care of. Make sure that you are adhering to the vows that you make on marriage. Settle down, Josh. So when we're bound to the law, like being married to the law, we have to serve the law. There's obligations that come with that, priorities that come with that. We die to the law and are raised with Christ to be bound to Him. For the purpose of this metaphor, there are things that go along with that. So now we no longer serve the law. Now we serve Christ. Now we don't have to try and adhere to a legal code necessarily, but we are supposed to serve Christ and put His priorities first. So what does that mean to serve Christ instead of serving the law? How does that look in a day-to-day life for sanctification purposes?
Are we talking practical examples here or general answer?
Yes. Whatever you're most comfortable with. what does Jesus say we'll do if we're his followers? If we're bound to him? Go ahead, Mario.
I would say, basically, this is where, for instance, sharing the good news comes in. Christians or let's say safe people also still sin, but hopefully they sin less and less and less. Even though at times maybe they fall for a season, they cannot fall completely. So let's do what is pleasing to God and share the good news, and know that whatever you do, you can't really, quote unquote, add to the whole thing Christ did. Because he did it all. He lived the perfect life and he died as the perfect sacrifice. We can't really add to that. But that doesn't mean we should continue on living in sin or whatever. Not sure if all of this makes sense the way I said it, but yeah.
No, it kind of goes along with what Kratos is putting in text instead of saying he's afraid of talking for some reason.
Well, it is the first time you said my name properly today, so.
Yeah, at least I'm not calling it carrots like everybody else.
Oh, like one other person. And you know what? Not the time.
Oh boy. I was gonna drill down on Kratos about the obey the law bit. But I think Kessa pulled out what he was gonna say, which is, if you love me, keep my commandments. That's what Jesus says. If you love me, keep my commandments. So how is that not just another way of saying be bound to the law?
Because it puts the ball in our court.
Well, the important thing to note is that the law, when referenced in the New Testament, typically is speaking of the Old Testament laws. And, you know, Christ definitely displayed a different perspective to the law than what at least the religious leaders at the time were teaching. It was a pretty novel idea not to just automatically stone someone for being an adulteress, whereas Christ offered forgiveness because he has that authority to. But it should have opened up people's eyes to the spirit of the law versus the actions of the law.
Yeah. And it's a change in motivation, right? So when you're bound to the law, you're trying to adhere to the law so you don't get punished. And so that you can be blessed, right? Prodigal God, study people, anyone? you're doing it to get something out of it, right? So it's kind of a fearful, manipulative sort of obedience. With Christ, we're serving him out of love and out of love and out of respect, instead of out of terror and trying to manipulate the situation for our own ends. Because we have been forgiven. Christ took our punishment for us. Therefore, we can serve him out of a spirit of joy and love, instead of trying to adhere to the law and do the right thing so we don't get punished. Exactly. I'm now looking at the chat, and Kessa pretty much summed up what I was trying to say in the chat. Oh, this is why I don't invite Kratos to come. Okay.
Bad.
So does that make sense? It's kind of, like I said, these 3 chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Romans are some of the hardest things for people to interpret in the Bible. But if you try to make it simple, we were married to the law. We're not married to the law anymore because we died. We were raised a new life in Christ. We're now bound to Christ. All right, we don't serve out of fear and trying to get something. We serve out of love and appreciation for what Christ has done. If you try to break it down, those simple concepts, it gets a little easier. So any more questions on this before we move on to the next section? Wash?
Just the other thing thinking about it is how much simplified the law is through Jesus rather than, well, Deuteronomy. We have, basically 2 commandments: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor.
Yeah, that's a good point. More principle based. Good point. All right. For the next section, we're going to back up to verse 5 because I want to tie verse 5 into a discussion for the next section. So if we can go 5 through 12, that would be great. I have a volunteer to read verses 5 through 12. Go ahead, Floofy.
For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, "You shall not covet." But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin was alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, through it killed me. So the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good.
Thank you. Okay. Paul makes a very startling claim here, and that's that the law actually creates a bigger desire to sin in us. It says it in verse 5, for while we were living in our flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit in death. And then in verse 8, but sin, seizing the opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. This seems kind of contrary to what we would think about the law, right? We'd think about the law would tell us what's right and what's wrong. But Paul's saying that the law actually can cause us to sin more. It can inflame sin in us. So what does that even mean? How does the law cause us to sin more? Mario has light orange first, and then Floofy.
I just wanted to say that thinking of children there, for instance, when you go and tell them don't touch that or don't go there and blah blah blah. Of course, children as they are, they have to do that. So that's something that fits in there. And apart from that, I was thinking the law is a mirror showing us who God is, so holy, showing us how we are so terribly corrupted and whatnot. And more than later. Thank you so far.
Good, Floofy.
The only thing I take from, the only thing I have to say about what you said was that I don't so much disagree as the way I see it is that the law isn't what's causing us to sin. It is sin in us taking like it says in verse 8, seizing an opportunity through the commandment. The law, like he said, is good, but it is the sin that is already in us taking opportunity of what the law has presented.
You guys are getting really good at spotting trick questions. So, I was thinking about. So, Kessa, sorry, go ahead. Do you have something to say?
No, I'm laughing at Josh.
I'm just ignoring him because if I acknowledge him, he'll continue. um, the so I was thinking about all week how to give an example for this. I was thinking about using the Augustine pairs example, and then I realized that I actually literally did this week. So, confession time. So last night, Lady Youngrith and I went to a play in a old-fashioned theater. I've been to this theater before, and you guys know I tend to carry. I like to be prepared, so I have some items that could be prohibited on me at times, like firearms and knives and those sorts of things. And I knew that they had a metal detector at this place, as in like the security guards come and they wand everyone who's coming in, and that goes over with me about as well as you'd imagine. But I wasn't going to ruin the night for Lady Youngrith, so I left my firearm at home. I left my knife at home. I was going through the prohibited items list just to make sure, double check for myself that all the stuff actually was listed legally to prohibit from me. And one of the things they put in the prohibited items list was a flashlight. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me, because everywhere I go, I'm carrying a gun, a knife, and a flashlight, right? I'm like, okay, there's only so much a man can put up with, right? I can understand the gun, I can understand the knife to an extent. Well, I'm not going to leave my flashlight. So, I don't, of course, tell anyone that I'm going with about this, because if this goes south, I'm going to plead ignorance. But I have a plan. I've got this plan as to how I'm going to sneak it in, right? So they're probably going to have me take my phone and my keys out of my pocket. So when I do that, I'll tuck the flashlight in between the phone and the keys, hold it up in my palms facing away from them, and they won't notice what's in my hand. Okay? Worked like a charm. Got right through. And I tell you, as I was walking away from that security point, I've never felt so satisfied this week as when I was putting that flashlight in my pocket going, yeah, got the flashlight in here. Now, I'll tell you what. I walk into every business and every building that I do throughout the week with a flashlight in my pocket, okay? And I don't think twice about it. It doesn't give me any sort of emotional high, but it gave me an emotional high taking that flashlight into that theater because it was prohibited and because I beat the system, okay? That is what Paul's talking about here. Paul is saying that humans have a part of the fall is our desire to want to be our own boss, to buck authority, specifically God's authority. So we may not know that something's prohibited, we may not know something's wrong, but as soon as we do, as soon as we know that God says you don't do that, we do what I did, sneaking the flashlight into the theater, right? Now we're going to do it, and it's going to be fun because it's not allowed, right? That's what happened in the Garden of Eden. That's what happens with sin. So Paul says, when the law can't save us, because as the law actually inflames sin, not that it's the law's fault, but it inflames sin because as soon as we know that it's prohibited, we want to do it. And then that makes us want to sin. So, he talks about that for covetousness, which is an internal thing. Now, whose fault is that? Is that the law's fault?
No.
Right, that's my fault. Yes, that's our fault. Yep. There's something wrong with us, not something wrong with the law. That's what he says is the law sin? No means. So, it's not the law's fault, it's our fault. We're too broken to be saved by the law. We had to be saved by something else. By Christ. The law is holy, and the commandment, it says in verse 12, so the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. That's not a defect in the law, it's a defect in us. So we can only be saved if we're broken from that system. The only way to break us from that system is for us to die, because that's part of who we are. Is we're bent towards sin, towards rebellion like that. But when we die and are raised to life in Christ, like we were talking about last chapter, we no longer are a slave to sin. We still have sinful tendencies, yes. Later example being an example of that myself. but we're no longer a slave. That we no longer that no longer has to be the defining part of who we are, right? We now have a choice to do the right thing because we're alive through Christ, and He gives us the Holy Spirit. Go ahead, Wash.
I have a historical question, and it's basically at this time it seems to fit into things that during the time of Jesus and before, were Jewish priests and rabbis tricking people with the law so that they can never fulfill it?
What do you guys think?
No.
Tricking people?
I know it's happened since, and that the Christian churches, several Christian churches and Catholic churches and things have been guilty of that, but it just seems to fit with the historical facts that, you know, they were using the complexity of the law to trick people.
Yeah, so I would say that the answer is not across the board. I think that there were certain schools, like the Pharisees, that weaponized the law. Oh, Kratos unmuted his mic. He was going to say something.
Huh?
Then he muted it back up again. Okay. There, just like there are certain people in certain denominations that weaponize the law today, make others look bad so that they can feel good about themselves.
Well, it sounds to me like you said, weaponizing it. It sounds like something that the Pharisees would do. Maybe part of the reason, many reasons they were so mad at Jesus was that, you know, they could trick people into giving more offerings, which go to them. Yep. So if Jesus comes and says, you do this, then it's kind of hard to trick somebody with that.
Yeah, well, I do think that's why Jesus and the Pharisees, not good friends. Because I think Jesus didn't like that about them. He didn't like the fact that they have problems themselves, have a plank in their own eye, if you will, and they're trying to get others to take the speck out of their eyes. So we talked like we talked about in the book study. But I do think that there has always been at least a faithful remnant, a small remnant throughout the history of God's people, of priests and other people in the tradition of serving God that are trying to do the right thing. Go ahead, Kratos.
Yeah, I mean, people haven't changed. You know, like we like to think that we've really progressed as a people, but as far as like, we just do it on Facebook instead of, you know, at a town square now. I mean, the idea, like, I seriously doubt most of the Pharisees were malicious on purpose. I mean, I'm sure there were some that were malicious. The majority of them, though, I would imagine, felt very strongly they were doing the right thing. Paul is an example of a religious leader that, you know, was doing absolutely terrible things, but was convinced otherwise.
Yeah.
And I would be willing to bet that there was, and if there was, it was a very small percentage of them, that there was probably never a particular Pharisee or a particular religious leader that turned the tide for them no longer following God's will. I mean, it's something that happened over generations of leaders just kind of progressively going down the wrong path, I suppose. But it would be no different if, like, let's pretend Jesus hadn't come back yet and he came back today. There would be an awful lot. I mean, just try to change like a business's standpoint on something nowadays and watch how people that claim to be Christians respond. You know, I mean, they will lose their mind, and then they're just as absurd as the people that we would call alt-left or you know, people that are, you know, passionate atheists that hate anything that resembles Christianity or even mentions God or anything like that. I mean, I would be very surprised to find out that the majority of religious leaders in Christ's day were purposely trying to trick people or take people the wrong way.
I wasn't trying to say the majority. I was trying to say like sects and different groups of them.
No, I understand. I would just think personally that it would be a very, very small number that were, and I don't even know. The Bible doesn't mention a whole lot about that sort of thing. But I mean, we definitely know that they took advantage of things. The marketplace and the temple is an example of at least one time where Jesus came across them and, he had had enough of their antics and started flipping tables. So who knows if there was ever any other instances like that just weren't mentioned.
And I would agree with that, Kratos or Josh. I still call you Josh?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. I feel like we've known each other long enough.
We're at that point in our
Crap, anyway.
relationship. That's fine.
10 years later, I can call you by first name. But I would agree with Josh and reiterate. Very few people see themselves as the villain, right? We're very good at self-justifying. We're very good at explaining away our actions and making excuses for ourselves. And we're also very good at not cutting anybody else any slack. So that's a human trait, the pharisaical trait. So I would say that most of these guys probably aren't trying to deliberately deceive people, but I would say that they probably have deceived themselves. And then that deception is passing on to how they treat people.
Yeah, and another point, and I don't remember exactly who said this to me, but someone did when I was a little bit younger. The line between you and a truly evil person isn't that big of a line. And it literally can be one wrong turn on the pathway that you live that turns you that is the ultimate bad decision you made that can really ruin a life and make you regret a lot. So I have always found it really interesting, and I'm not saying you did this, Wash, or you're doing this, but just in general talking about the Pharisees. I always found it really interesting, like how much modern day Christians look down on the Pharisees, and I really don't think they're all that different than a lot of evangelicals today. They were convinced they understood the Bible better than most, or than their time the law, which that's a lot of Christians, and they were convinced that this person they had never heard of or never seen, couldn't know more than they did, and it became more of a stubborn thing than it was a logic thing, obviously. But I mean, you would be hard pressed to walk up to most Christians and convince them, and I'm talking about like foundationed, that's not a word, but people with very strong foundation in their faith, and try to convince them of something that they don't quite think is right. And if you don't believe me, check a lot of our forum threads, because they usually they can end in pretty aggressive words back and forth. And I don't think anyone goes into those conversations with ill intent. It just, if you really believe in something, I love the free will debate. So if you really believe that you have free will, and I come up to you and I try to convince you that you don't, unless you just happen to be a very even-keeled person or someone that can keep perspective in the conversation, you're not going to take it very well often, especially from someone you don't know at all. And they didn't know who Jesus was until they met him, obviously. So.
Right. It takes a certain amount of humility to change. Right. We just talked about how the reason why the law doesn't work in the first place is because we enjoy, we're part of our prideful nature is enjoying to rebel against it because we want to be the boss. And I would say the more buttoned up you see yourself, the more of the good guy you see yourself, the more pride you have, the more difficult it is for you to change. That's why the Pharisees and rulers Jesus tended to clash with. The tax collectors, prostitutes, people who knew that they had issues were the ones that Jesus got along very well with, because they didn't have quite the pride of the the rulers and the religious leaders he was talking to, which always has made me. It's interesting that Kratos said that, because I was talked about this to my good friends. Actually, one of the people I went to the opera with last night, about how if Jesus were to come today and just do like a check-in on the evangelical church in North America, how many of us would be willing to change? Even if we accepted the fact that, maybe he's saying some right things, I think we'd dig in and say, that goes against standard wisdom, or goes against this, or goes against that, or I feel attacked, that sort of thing. I think that he would have not as warm of a reception as we think he would have, if that makes any sense. I blew right by Mario's orange light, so Mario, if you want to go ahead.
No worries there. I put it there in text. I was about to say that we are all evil, none of us is good, and we all would likely be even more evil if God wouldn't put some restraint on us. And in some way, the law also does it. Sure it quote unquote makes us want to break stuff, break the whole thing and but it's also in a way there to restrain us, and God is restraining us because I'm pretty sure we all could be even more evil if the whole thing wasn't even there, if God removed the kind of restraint that's on us. Know what I'm trying to get across?
Yeah, I do. Yep. So, that's all I had for tonight. What's the takeaway from this? What do we gather from this? What does this mean? Yes, Kessa, can you expand on that?
The last Bible study, Scribe talked a significant amount about how we were saved from something for something. We didn't just stop sinning, we were now moving toward and through sanctification. So we didn't die to the law just to, as an end in itself, just to get away from the law. We're released from the law so we can have another kind of life. We can actually have a genuine relationship that works the way it's supposed to. It's a union that, so to speak, produces things, whereas the old one just was in some ways an exercise in futility as far as saving us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and I think that's a big key to Romans, is that we're not just dead to sin, dead to the law, but that we're alive to Christ. And that should shape our priorities, that should shape our life, and that should encourage us moving forward in our week this week. All right. That's all I had. Anything you guys want to add before we close out in prayer? All right. Any prayer requests we didn't get the first time around that we need to get on the way out?